Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ecozoic Forum 2022. Now I'd like to begin the afternoon session. In the session 5, that we're going to talk about life and security and life and politics. And this is a unique combination. We are going to cover the two contradicting concepts. For a long time, People for Earth has contemplated in the biocracy and also in the Earth jurisprudence. For a long time, People for Earth has contemplated the concept, and surprisingly, the world has become more interested in ecology. Despite such interest, that we are seeing that there are conflicts happening in ecology, especially due to the war between Ukraine and Russia. But at the same time, people are seeking coexistence in the political arena and also in our life. Mr. Kim, at the congratulatory remarks that he mentioned that he is from actually Global Environmental Pact, and there are efforts going on to give personhood to the nature, and also planetary governance, which respects life throughout the globe, is also planetary politics. And these discussions were also made by Mr. Kim. He is a commission head of Decarbonization Green Growth Committee under the presidential office. So these experiments are taking place in the world that we're living in. We are honored to have 3 speakers today. Our big theme is life and security, which is life security. So we will seek new political and ecological approaches. First of all, I'd like to introduce the 3 speakers. Professor Jonathan Everts is working at Martin Luther University. If you hear the name Martin Luther, I don't know how to put it. It's so touching because he is such the wisdom of our time, because he embarked a new era in studies. So if we have time for question and answers, then we'd like to hear some history about the Martin Luther University. So Jonathan Everett University. Lignite translated into galtan in Korean, and lignite is one of the sources aggravating climate change. And the professor will share examples at some districts how lignite has triggered efforts to phase out lignite, and also the process of finding the identity of human and the citizen's role. And Professor Simon Dalby is Wilfrid Laurier University, from Wilfrid Laurier University. Simon Dalby, Professor Simon Dalby is the second speaker, and Professor Dalby actually, his presentation was supposed to happen at the second time, but I'd like to ask him to present as the third speaker, and he will talk about security. When it comes to security, we often think about classical weapons like nuclear weapons. However, he points out that the concept of security is expanding. So in this session, he will share his valuable advice for us to expand our knowledge in security. Let me make sure that the sequence is right. The first is Professor Jonathan Everts, and the second is Professor Simon Dalby, and also the last one is Professor Junsoo. And Professor Kim Junsoo investigated the relationship between the state and nature from the perspective of urban political ecology. And also he is leading a biocracy group that I am also happen to be a member of. So I'm going to ask many questions to Mr. Kim. So we have three speakers, Professor Everts and Professor Dalby, and also the researcher, Mr. Kim, will share about their opinions, and also they can exchange opinions. Last but not least, I am also the moderator, and I will have a chance to share my thoughts as I submitted my article. In relation to security, I have noticed the change of current in the White House, and I'd like to share the changes of currents in security.
원래 순서와 달리 흐름을 생각했을 때 조나단 에버트 교수님이 먼저 발표를 해주시고
So the first speaker will be Jonathan. Okay, this is the final change. First is Professor Everts. Second is researcher Kim. And third is Professor Dalby. And I will be the last one. So please feel free to use your time. And then when we have time for comments, that we're going to exchange questions and answers. And we're providing simultaneous interpretation at the moment. Korean is channel number 5, and English is channel number 6. I think I talked too much, and I'm sorry if I have given you some confusion. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Everts, and he will share about the example of lignite in Germany. Do we have Professor Everts?
Yes, you do. Good morning. Good afternoon to Korea.
Good to see you. Now the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So you can see my slides. Thank you as well. I was honored and delighted to be part of that conference and to talk to you about my most recent research. As it is with most recent research, some of it is preliminary, and I hope you don't mind my at times sketchy slides, but I'll try to guide you through them as best as I can to show you why I think this is an important research that we are doing here in Germany, in the central part of Germany especially, but with some global connections, I think. So next slide, please. So what I was told the other day by another German researcher talking to colleagues in East Asia, as he said, that apparently Germans usually start their presentation by an agenda. So I thought, why not have an agenda in my presentation as well? So this paper does 3 things at least. So it begins with 3 speech acts in the context of Germany's phasing out of lignite coal mining and combustion. And the 3 speech acts are climate change, coal exit, and structural transformation. And I'll tell you more about this in a minute. The paper posits that these 3 speech acts constitute 3 different scales that are interlinked and somehow negotiated. And then the paper recasts speech acts, which is a very ancient kind of theory, as practices of scaling, and their interplay as politics of scaling. Next slide, please. So just a quick reminder, I'm not a discourse theorist or analyst. I'm not a speech act theory person, but I cannot deny that I have my roots in cultural geography and all the cultural theoretical discussions we've had over the last 20 to 30 years. And when I started my research here in central Germany on the lignite mining and the phasing out of lignite coal mining, it came to me that speech acts really are having a very important impact here, because of a lot of this sort of phase out that's happening is something that is made and done first and foremost through talking about things, and uttering words makes here a clear difference. So I went back to this theory by Austin you remember things like, I hereby declare you husband and wife and things like that. You say something, and while you say it, you do it. So wedding someone, for example, is something that you do by using words. So Austin's idea was at the time that to say something is not just to state something, but to do something. So doing things through uttering words. And then, of course, many other philosophers have picked this up and put this in different directions. Probably one of the most sophisticated approaches is that of Judith Butler. She read Althusser, Foucault, and many others, and came up with a subjectivation theory that is actually a theory that contends that subjects come into being through interpellation, a term she takes from Althusser. So if you call someone in a specific way, you're calling that subject into being. So you're not just the person you are, but you're also always the person that you are called upon in some sense. And you cannot not respond to this. And this is really important. So even if someone says to you, you're a white man, you're a black man, whatever, even if you turn your back, this is some kind of reaction. So you're already reacting to that sort of subjectivation. And how I use this and find this important is something that will become clear in a few slides. Just briefly, I'm personally more on a practice theory path. So this is where I stand theoretically. But even Theodor Schatzky, the practice theorist that I read the most probably, says practices are a mix of doings and sayings. And sayings, he contends, of course, are also doings, but they are very particular doings that have a particular meaning. They can have a special importance, just as speech acts can have a special importance, especially in political contexts where talk and text is really important. Next slide, please. All right, so and the politics of scaling and the concept of scale, just a quick reminder, is also a not very new debate, but some that is very pertinent to my research at the moment. So a more traditional approach said that scales such as the local or the global existed and interacted. And there was some suggestion that these scales can be used by people for their own purposes. So you could, for example, jump scales by making a very local issue or turning a very local issue into a more national or global issue, making it such in this way a bit more important. So important work was by Neil Smith, for example, or Andrew Harrod in the 90s. And they also are responsible for coining the term politics of scale, which is just that. So you make something more important by jumping scales, for example. But the problem with that notion of scale is that some other authors then found out is that it somehow reifies scale. So as if scale is something that is just there for us to use, or in the worst sense is something that does something by itself. But then, as Marston et al. Have pointed out in a highly debated paper in 2005, scales do not exist, maybe not at all. It is us who make the scales in the first place. So we need to focus less on what the scale is, but more on how scales are made or come into being or how crafted. So Brenner suggested already a bit earlier that we do not talk of politics of scale, but the politics of scaling, or phrases that scalecraft would be a pertinent term. So we focus more on the practices and activities that make our world appear as one of scalar order. And especially if you look at political processes, I think it's very obvious how this is an important approach to understand what's happening. Next slide, please. So I promised you to say something about 3 speech acts that I find important in the context of my research. I'm sorry I missed a slide or forgot to put in a slide about my research area. I just say something very briefly to give you some context. You all know that coal is not a very clean way of producing energy when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, and lignite coal especially is the worst. So it has a very low quality and efficiency level. And he has a lot of lignite coal, and very traditionally we have been one of the largest lignite coal users, and our emissions due to that are quite high. So 15% of the emissions that we have in Germany, CO2, are from lignite coal combustion, and we are the largest no other state is as big as us in using lignite coal. And obviously there is some connection there to thinking about the use of lignite coal in the context of thinking about climate change. So this is where it all comes from. So speech act number 1, climate change. So if someone says climate change, this can also be used as this kind of speech act, and it invokes, and this is what I'm interested in here, a certain kind of scale, and the scale is that of the planet Earth. So by saying climate change, we imply there are scales that have a bearing on us as human beings and on our daily lives, and beyond that, that we usually can experience, such as the home place or the workplace and things like that. But if we turn this in a more performative fashion, then we would say climate change is not only invoking that kind of scale, but it actually produces it. So if we take Marston et al. Series, there is no planetary or global scale, but there's one that can be produced through certain kinds of practices, such as the speech act of climate change. And the planetary scale of climate change then does not exist independently from climate change, but it is its scalar gestalt, if you like. So the Climate Change Speech Act is a politics of scaling. It constructs the planetary scale and is imbued with associations of importance and urgency. And this is something that is the session about, I think, as well, to see how the climate became a new political paradigm. Next slide, please. So Speech Act number 2, and now we're on the level of the national German level, so to speak, is lignite coal. I just already introduced it a little bit, is one of the worst polluting coals that you can use, and heavily part of CO2 emissions that are responsible for climate change. No other country produces and burns as much lignite coal as Germany does. And this was acknowledged in Germany a few years back. So 2018, the federal government said, yes, this is a problem, and we have a national duty here to solve this problem for the greater good of the planet, so to speak. So they decided to exit coal. This is the German term Kohleausstieg that was used. And I said I would say the Speech Act as such is Kohleausstieg. That's the term that is most important here. And I translated with exit coal, but it's often translated as well as a phase out of coal. So, and they decided to phase it out until 2038. And 2019, so 3 years back, this was a decision by the federal government. So the federal government, the national government, made it their task to actually inhibit any further use of lignite coal after that date. We have within Germany 3 active lignite coal mining districts. One is in the west, one near Cologne, one is in central Germany. This is where I am based and I'm doing my research, and the other one is to the far east. And to ease the structural transformation that is very likely to appear in those mining districts, the federal government is spending up to 40 billion euros over those up to 20 years. So yes, basically this second Speech Act constitutes another scale, not the one of the planetary, but in the sense the national one as the one that is the acting scale here to speak. So the ones that have to take the responsibility and the duty of doing something against climate change by inhibiting the use of lignite coal in the future. But also invoking already the regional scale of economic restructuring. And I come to that with the next slide, please. So this is number 3, structural transformation. This term doesn't translate well. It's often translated with these words, but in German we say Strukturwandel, classic German compound word, which is very interesting as a word in itself, because it has 2 opposite words in it. So Struktur is structure, so it's something more solid, and Wandel is change, something that is more fluid. And we have it in one word, and it was a very important term used in planning and in politics in the 90s and 80s, when the phase out of hard coal was happening in the Western German Ruhr area. And now this term resurfed. So over more than 20 to nearly 30 years, no one ever used that term again anymore. So it was like gone. No one had a use for this term. And suddenly it came up everywhere. It became really, really big and is really important now. And it's the way that these 3 lignite coal areas are now addressed. So if you say Strukturwandel in Germany, no one thinks of old rural area or something, but everyone thinks of these 3 lignite mining areas, and that it is their task now to transform out of their fossil economies that they have had for so long. So I did something which maybe, I don't know if it really works for everyone, but I went back to some reading that I did a long time ago in a completely different context. I reread Stuart Hall's work on racism and on cultural identity, because the identity question here in Eastern Germany especially is such a big, important issue. It has not been solved properly over the last years, because after reunification, I mean, this is something that many people are still aware of. 1990, Germany was a divided country, 2 parts, West and East Germany. The eastern part, the former socialist one, became part of the Western Germany. So it was a big reunited country. And then the post-socialist transition into a market economy, it was for many, many people, this was a horrific time. They lost their jobs. The economy downturn was really hard and hit hard on them. Many people left, so there was a huge outflux of people. And this is still the ripple effects of that. Still more than 30 years onwards, you still can see it and feel it. And it's very, very important to the people still here in this area. So I was thinking maybe to understand the issues they are having and the times they are going through, maybe it helps to use some empathetic kind of theory like the one from Stuart Hall. So one moment in Stuart Hall's writing is where he talks about the othering of Black people and how that is in Frantz Fanon's work epitomized by the sentence, "Look, mama, a black man." So it's like this is this classic interpellation moment where you cannot not react to it, and it does something to you. Knowing full well that this is not the same thing, but what happens and what many people feel here when we talk to them, when I talk to them, is that they are looked upon as Strukturwandel subjects that are in structural transformation. So everyone points the finger at them. We have climate change as like this planetary thing. We have coal phase out as a national duty, but then the ones who have to do the transitioning, it's the ones in those regions, as if that was their fault alone that we have climate change and all these things. So they feel singled out and they feel pointed at. So I try to translate this as, look, mama, a transition region or a transition person, if you like. And there's many ways how this is happening. Let me skip to the other sentence by Stuart Hall. Another interesting thing he observes is that there is an outside history to any inside history of regional identity. His example is English tea, but you could also reverse it in the East German context and say, if the regional story, you cannot tell the regional story of coal mining without the outside story. So you have to talk about the Wende, which is the reunification thing in 1990. You have to talk about the history of industrialization of Germany as a whole, and not just today, but over the last 200 years, and how important lignite coal was, for example, electrifying Berlin in one time. You have also to talk about globalization, the loss of labor, and all that, and other important decisions. So the exit from nuclear power that was decided more than 20 years ago has a huge bearing on lignite mining, because lignite mining was already on the downturn or on the phasing out 20, 30 years ago. And then the German government decided not to use nuclear power anymore. So something else had to step in, and that was lignite mining. So the locals here actually fight for this kind of story. So they say everyone's just looking at us as a transition region and trying to foreground a regional story, but actually there's a much bigger story here to tell, and we're only one part of this. So again, taking cue from Hall, it is that which is narrated, which is one's own self. So there is no regional identity, and don't want to plug into regional identity discourses from the 90s and 2000s, but to say I'm using instead the term of the self, which is a far more contested term, and reminds us that there are subject positions which are always emerging and negotiated, and here negotiated in the process of this kind of interpellation, this look at transition person. And there are no binary positions then very easily to have these, in another context, Hall says, anomalous sliding positions ever in process. I think that's a really nice phrasing of it. And you can see and observe this here too, even if that has nothing to do with racial or sexual identity in that case. Next slide, please. So to give you, and to come to a close very soon, few examples, and this is a bit, maybe feels a bit random at the moment, and I'm in the process of working through all the data we have gathered so far. But there's yet another way of how scales are crafted and come into being through this transition and structural change discourse. And we have political practices, I would say, very crudely here, probably from the outside. So not from those regions that are delineated as you are the transition regions, but those who come from outside and say, like, we are now helping you to do that transition, or it is our task or duty to do that. And we are in contact of many of those who have a political mandate to do so, or have the task to do this. And it's very interesting to see that within our own Bundesland, so you know Germany is divided up into 16 states, and they have quite a lot of sovereignty themselves. So this Bundesland here, the state of Saxony-Anhalt, they have a state agency that does nothing else than to think about how structural change is to be brought about in this lignite coal region. And they decided to go for the new European Bauhaus competition, something that the EU Commission set up. So the idea is you have projects awarded that show that you can build sustainable and that you can build economically, but it also has to look beautifully. So that transition and to sustainable future doesn't just mean CO2 reduced, but maybe it's even something desirable in a fashionable sense. So they formed politically here in this place, the Saxony-Anhalt project, and they actually just chose one very small place. So it's the one you see in the picture. This is like an old factory that produced pram chairs. This factory has been abandoned for more than 20 years now. And this will now be revamped into a very nice, will be the archive of the town of Zeitz. It's a small industrial town here, or post-industrial town, and it will have some co-working spaces and a few other things. And they just took on this project that was already existing and enhanced it with a few more fancy architectural ideas, and said, this is how we show that we can do this transitioning with a new European Bauhaus approach. So they use it as a lever to achieve their goals. And this set off a really interesting dynamic within the town. They brought in lots of experts from completely outside places. They wanted to be no UFO, as they said, no UFO, but they wanted to be part of the town's social dynamics. And I'm not sure that this really worked too well for them. Others said this is like grandma's den or shed or whatever, where you can still find and explore things that people do not know yet. Yet another sort of othering, I think, is in there as well. Then we get the local perspectives on these projects, not just that one, but other projects as well. And very often we hear that they think money goes to the wrong project. So they feel like if there is money given, handed out to the region, they'd rather see it going to the people directly and not going in some kind of project that's some way or another more or less obviously linked to structural transformation and climate change. So yeah, I don't have time to go into this, but maybe in the discussion we can talk about this as well. And then there's also something else. It's not just that people are critical of where the money goes, they're also critical about, or they even deny that there is something like structural change happening or necessary. So we find that people would say within that region that they say we're not part of that region. So to them, it's more perforated. It's more like we have answers like, no, in our village or in our town there is no structural transformation because we are not dependent on the coal mining. So the coal miners, they would be the next village. Talk to them. They have to transition. We do not have to transition. So this is an interesting thing as well. So kind of denial as some kind of response to this sort of interpellation. There are a few powerful narratives that are woven through here and that everyone can repeat. And this is the political level as much as people on the street. So as I already hinted at, the 1990 reunification and its aftermath, many people still say we are still working on that. So it's not achieved yet fully. The transition was so big and so huge. So we do not have the power yet, the energy to transition once more. This is something you can hear very often. And the other one is history and path dependency of the region as an industrial region. So people are very much looking at the last 200 years, forgetting, of course, what was before, and saying like we need to still identify as an industrial region. So whenever you come up with a new idea for the future, they always want it to be an industrial one. And then there are a few political practices from inside. Sorry, I had some of this in German, but it's more or less saying you have one mayor from a mining town telling you all about how important industry is. And then the big thing he did over the last 2 years to make sure that his town is not left behind is he took money in his own hand and built a road which connected the town much better to the big city of Leipzig. And wondrous as it is, the inhabitants increased. So he has now a lot more people living in his town because now they can commute to Leipzig, which is a big economic hub, in less than 30 minutes. So it's actually not the industry that helped the town to survive, but it was just one road that he built with his own money, so to speak. And of course, they all apply for the structural transformation money that's handed out through the German bonds of 40 billion euros, but also through European money that comes into the region as the Just Transition Fund money. So that will be 360 million euros alone for central Germany. Next slide, please. So I come to an end and to conclude here, my thoughts on the research that we are trying to do here in this region. So there are, to my mind, a few scales that are constituted by certain kinds of discursive practices, such as the planetary scale, which is the one that we are talking about when we talk about climate change. But that is rescaled into a national level in Germany through the rhetoric of exiting coal as a national duty, which then again is turned into a regional level, which is the transition regions. There is EU talk, like the new Green Deal, the Just Transition Fund, but also the funds that are used for phasing out coal in those regions. And then this is again rescaled into a very local project. So we have urban regeneration, the one I showed you, the new European Bauhaus example, or infrastructures project like the road I was just talking about in this other town. So there are certain rescalings going on that prioritize then the local, which sets off another host of social dynamics. And there is a formation then of those structural change or transition subjects, the local people, as well as those who come from outside, the active or involved outsiders. And this meeting of different subject positions is the dynamic that I'm interested in at the moment, and that I think will determine what happens and what will be or can be achieved in this region over the next 10 to 20 years up to 2038, when they want to have fully achieved the phasing out of lignite coal mining. Thank you so much.
네, 감사합니다, 에버트 교수님.
Thank you.
과거 아주 오래전에 제가
That was very interesting. When I was in the graduate school, I learned about this kind of linguistic theory. And at the time, it seems like a very abstract one. It was painful. I was not able to understand that. And Dr. Everts, you showed a specific example. And you talked about the regional identity, especially about the climate change and how it can have the ripple impact to the regional impact. You talked about the speech active theory, and you talked told you about the ripple effect that is going step by step by rescaling.
김준수 연구원님이나
And after
달비 교수님도
Mr. Kim and Dalby
여러
will
가지 좀 질문을 해주시면
ask some questions
감사하겠습니다.
about
저는
your
개인적으로
presentation.
미국 정치를 전공하고 있어서
I personally majored in US politics, West Virginia, and the Rust Belt, and that kind of regional identity is something that I am really interested in. And thank you very much for giving me the wonderful motivation. Please wait for a while.
자, 이어서 두 번째로
And now, let me invite
김준수 연구원님, 네, 방금 전에
Invite Mr. Junsoo Kim.
알칸이라는 소재를 활용했다면
Dr. Everett talked about the lignite coal, and Mr. Kim will tell us about the sand.
고래를 가지고 또 새로운 시각을 제공해 주실 겁니다. 예, 시작하시죠.
He will give us new perspective about using sand. I'm Kim Junsoo, who is working for the Center for the Anthropocene Studies.
Center for Interdisciplinary Regional Studies라는 곳과 저희 카이스트
And in KAIST,
하게 됐어요.
we have the Center for the Anthropocene Studies, and actually we studied along with Jonathan's Institute.
물질을 매개한 어떤 스케일
And we talk about the politics of the scale, and we are studying together along with our German counterpart. And in that vein, I'm going to tell you about the national division between South Korea and North Korea and tell you about the politics of the material, especially about the environmental fixed strategy, how that can be linked with the Korea's development urbanization and how Korea kept the cheap nature and how that has built the ground or the urban environment where we are in.
슬라이드를 영어로 준비를 했는데요. 보시면은 자본세라는 말을 많이 들어보셨습니다.
Many people talk about the Capitalocene.
논의가 되고 있는 담론이고요.
That has been discussed from the Marxism factor.
경제적인 정치적인 위기들의 근본
As we are living within the crisis, and the reason is because of the end of the cheap resources and cheap nature.
더 이상 저렴한 자연이 없어졌기 때문에
We are lack of cheap nature. That's why we have the economic, environmental, and social crisis and issues.
여기에 더해서 최근에 2000년
In addition to it, after the year 2000, we came up with a new concept, production of nature.
특히 우리가 알고 있는 사회라는 공간이 자연과
The place, society, is not totally separate from nature. In the process of the space production, we used lots of nature and natural resources.
수정 전략이라는 것들을 좀 보면 좋을 것 같습니다.
There are a few spatial fixed strategies. In the circulation of the capital, there are some accumulated crises. So when we have too much capital, in that case, there can be some free resources, and those free resources and abundant resources can be injected into real estate properties.
데이비드 하비를 비롯해서 몇몇 이제 비판적인
That's the argument from the David Harvey and some of other scholars. We call that as a spatial fix. The idle resources are now reinvested. The spatial fix can be used in various contexts, and it can also generate some of the new discourses like ecological fixes or some other fixes like environmental fixes. Today, I'm going to focus on the environmental fixes.
혹은 도시 연구,
It's been used in the urban studies, sociology, and geologies.
이 개념을 사회 자연적인 어떤 위기를 수정하고
When we are trying to fix the social and environmental crisis, the country or the state government is using some resources, especially natural resources. There have been many studies about the developmental urbanization of Korea and in East Asia, especially Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong. There have been some studies about too much urbanization, transboundary urbanization, and they have three commonalities.
발전주의 도시화는 어쨌든 굉장히 시간과
Developmental urbanization has time and space compression because time and space compression can generate some speculations. Just like, as we can see in Korea, there is a speculation about the real estate. And sometimes the production of the exceptional spaces can be made, for example, like a duty-free zone or the special economic zone, so that people can work on special strategy. When we have those kind of exceptional spaces, we can have industrial clusters, and it's going to cause some inequality.
이 리스크스케이프는 조나단 에버츠가
And riskscape, according to Jonathan's,
응축된 도시화 과정을 겪다 보니 굉장히 많은 양의 에너지와 자원
and too much energies are concentrated and used. And in Korea, we have the nuclear power plant as an example. And another theory is planetary urbanization.
행성적 도시화는 기존의 우리가 자본 순환의 도시화 과정에 더불어서 도시의
Planetary urbanization means that from the planetary level, energy and materials are being used and consumed.
응축의 과정이 있고
So it's more like a compression, and in other way, it is on the process of expansion.
확산의 과정에 좀 더 주목을 해보면
And we should focus more on the expansion.
어떤 지역에서
We should think about how the urban space is connected to which, and we need to understand how the terrestrial boundaries can be connected to some of the material and natural resources.
한계들이 있었습니다. 우리가 기존에 정치 생태학이라는 분야를 연구할 때
There were some limitations in my research method and in the previous research.
공간을 연구한다 했을
In the past, when we study about Seoul, you cannot understand Seoul by studying Seoul only. You should study Seoul and many other related cities. So we should overcome the spatial fetishism
경계를 넘어서서 어떻게
and should think about the non-human actors and other factors. Also, we should go beyond methodological territorialism.
가지고서는 그 공간을 제대로
A single territory cannot tell you a whole story. And also, we should overcome the methodological nationalism. Korea, Seoul, when we are studying only about the Korea and Seoul, if we do not consider Seoul's relations with other countries, we cannot fully understand Korea or Seoul.
탈 경계 어떤 물질들의 연결성을 보면
So, more than human
마찬가지로 방법론적
state
도시
or
주의로
statecraft,
우리가 도시를
and
하나의
that kind
도시로
of
고정되고
approach is really necessary. And another limitation is methodological cityism, because a city cannot be fixed. I mean, cannot stay as it is, because the city is changing and city is transforming itself. What I want to focus on is sand, and there are many studies about the sand. For example, labor struggle have been the key focus in the previous studies when they talk about the politics of the soil and post-colonial issues, technical issues, and the land use, and sand and civilization. And those were the key research focus or the research approaches. And they talked about the raw material, site, social political struggling in mining sites, post-colonial regimes, especially in underdeveloped countries.
도시화의 측면에서 특히 동아시아 맥락에서 도시화의 측면에서
But what I want to tell you is about urbanization, how the raw material has been going through the political and economic circles, and eventually they formed the spaces where we are living in Korea and East Asia. Sand is really important aggregate used for cement. And sand is the basic material to build any buildings. And we have a concrete or the mortar.
여기 모래를 채취하기 위해서는 자연을 채굴할 수밖에 없습니다. 강 바닥에서
To extract the sand, you have to rely on nature, riverbed, mountain, seabed, or you should break the rocks.
이 모래가 가지고 있는 물질적인 특성들이 몇 가지
However, sand is unique.
모래가 굉장히 무겁죠.
Sand is heavy.
채산성을 맞추려면 50kg
So, if you move the sand by more than 50 kilometers, your profitability will go down. So, you should have the local source for your sand.
1000개 이상의 그 채산
That's why we have more than 2,000 small industrial sources of sand. And you can see many of the sand sites. We have more than 2,000 sand sites and sand extracting companies.
집중이 되면은 지역 간 모래 수축
So sometimes there can be imbalance in supply and demand if the buildings are being built in a certain region only. So there can be break in the supply and demand.
모래의 양도 굉장히 많습니다.
Also, Korea is using a lot of sand. As you can see, 170 million cubic meters of the sand are used in Korea. What is the political key moment starting from the late 1990s to early 2010s? Seoul
다들 기억하시겠지만
has made significant urbanization.
2023년에 마무리가 되어가지고
Seoul Metropolitan Urban Development Project from 2003 to 2023.
전반적인 개발 사업과 더불어서 수도권
Seoul has a urbanization, and Seoul was providing lots of apartment, and lots of sands have been extracted around the year 2004. There was a peak demand about the sand, and there was a significant imbalance about sand.
민주정부가 이제 자리를 잡았던 시기고 남북 간 경협
Ironically, in 2004, there was economic cooperation between North Korea and South Korea. During the Kim Dae-jung and Nomu현 administration, South Korea imported sand from North Korea, and before the nuclear test, South Korea imported lots of sand from North Korea. Let me tell you a few issues.
제재 대상으로 삼으면서 2009년
In 2009, UN sanction banned the sand import from North Korea. That's why we do not have any import of the sand from North Korea. And
서해안과 남해안에서
the politics of environment were going on. In the Southern Sea and the Western Sea, in South Korea, we were not able to extract sand anymore because the fishermen were complaining about this because they are losing their fish stock.
자국 내에서 한국 내에서 이제 모래
So in Korea, even though we have the peak demand for sand, but we were not able to provide sand anymore. So because of the political détente between the two Koreas and because of the environmental policy within South Korea, starting from the
까지의 어떤 정치적
late 1990s to early 2000.
일기 신도시도 있었죠. 일기 신도시는
In addition to it, there is another factor. The first urbanization plan was from 1989 to 1995, and the second plan is something that I'm studying on.
가장 본격적으로 이루어지고
And Seoul's new town development were accelerated, and now Seoul is working on the third
한국 정부
development
입장에서는
plan.
계속해서 이제 저렴한 모래를 공급을 해줘야
For South Korea, they need cheap sand continuously. There should be continuous supply of the cheap sand. The volume should be big enough.
정치 자연적인 그런 조건들이 필요했었죠. 근데 이제 이 모래의 역사를 추적하다 보니까
When I was looking into the history of the sand, yes, even before the year 2000, in 1994, there was a case like this. The North Korean sand was imported to South Korea via the East Seaport in South Korea. That was really interesting. The North Korea's sand were brought, especially
이 모래를 이제 가지려고
many people wanted to have access to the sea because they lost their hometown in North Korea.
해서 들어온 서평
It was a symbolic sand.
건설용으로 활용하기보다는 좀 더 이게
And the construction company wanted to distribute that to
1kg씩
the separate families, and they distributed the sand to South Korean people who lost their hometown.
모래를 부모님의 이제 묘소에 갖다 뿌리는
So sometimes they brought the sand to the tomb of their ancestors. So it was a symbolic gesture. Anyway, first the North Korean sand was brought, but it was once again symbolic, not for the economic purpose. But
일기신도시를 잠깐
when we had the first urban development plan in South Korea,
아파트 파동이 있었습니다.
there was an issue about the
평촌 분당 쪽에
apartment that was built with the
우리가 그 바다에서
sand from the seabed.
하지 않아서 시멘트
Because the salinity was too high, there was a crack on the apartment, and many people called it as a salty apartment. There was a huge issue. So when you are importing sand, to reduce the salt within the sand is really, really important. And at the time, many people were complaining about the quality of the sand extracted from South Korea. That's why they find out the alternative, the North Korean sand.
굉장히 저렴하고
North Korean sand is in high quality and it is much cheaper compared to the sand extracted from South Korea.
이 상징성을 넘어서 경제적인 자원
It is not just the symbolic, it can be economic sources.
피크를 쳤을 때는 최대 63%까지 수도권
Around 63% of the apartments were built with the sand from North Korea. In the second phase of the development, yes, 63% of the buildings were built with North Korean sand. However, because of the UN sanction, we cannot have access to the sand anymore. That's why Korea started with the Four River project. Now we have the third phase of the Seoul Metropolitan urban development. Where can we have access to that cheap nature again?
이 한국의 어떤 환경 정치의 내부에서
So within the politics of environment, in the now late 1990s, Korea banned any extraction of the sand in Korea,
어민의 보호를 위해서
especially to protect the fishermen because they were losing too much fish stock.
2004년까지 한참 이제 가장 모래 수요가
Between 2002 to 2004, when the sand was in high peak, Korea banned extraction of the sand from the sea. And Korea came up with the framework for the National Aggregate Plan
본격적으로 하게 됐죠.
and started to provide the sand to many of the engineering and construction companies. After 2009, Korea was working on Four Rivers project.
리버베드의 샌드를 드래깅, 익스트랙팅해서
Riverbed sand dragging was done to distribute more sand.
무너졌습니다.
However,
이제 한국에서는
the supply and demand was not that stable. In 2020, Korea is now on the third phase of the urban development, and Korea started to extract the sand once again from the sea. They deregulated to extract the sea again, and this is an ongoing issue in South Korea. When you take a look at the import of North Korean sand, it was a political, symbolic gesture, and this can be a economic agenda to build more buildings.
어디에 모래들이 어느 지역으로 이동하는지
I've been analyzing
건설사가 이거를
the source and target of the use of sand.
2008년이 이제 가장 북한에서 모래를 가장 많이
In 2008, we imported the biggest volume of sand from North Korea,
어디로 나갔는가
and I am tracking the source and target of the sand and the route of the sand. Incheon port was the most used port to import sand, followed by Pyeongtaek and Mokpo. Incheon usually received the sand extracted from Haeju,
경기도
and that was distributed to Hwaseong, Bucheon, Paju, and Incheon, where there are some cement factories.
수도권 남부 수도권으로 경기도 화성 용인
And the sand coming from Pyeongtaek has been distributed to other regions, as you can see on the map.
모래 공급도 그렇지만 부산의 해운대 앞바다에 모래를 메우기 위한 북한산 모래도 투입이 됐었어요.
The North Korean sand were used
북한 모래가
to provide the better sea or the shore environment in South Korea. After 2009, it has become the item for UN economic sanction, and we cannot import sand from North Korea
계속 감시를 하고 있습니다.
anymore.
지금도 이제 감시를 하고 있는데 보면은 이제 한국으로의 공급이 끊기고
They are being monitored, so as you can see from other countries like China, they are now importing some of the
저는
sand.
이제 이런 과정 속에서 남북의 관계를 남한의 어떤 시선으로만 볼게
And
아니라
in that
북한에서는
process,
어떻게 보고 있을까라는 좀 호기심을 갖고
I was wondering how North Korea is regarding this kind of import and the movement of the sand.
자연을 갖다 판단을
The socialistic natural resources were sold for the capitalistic country. So I tried to look into some of the reference documents in North Korea, and they believed sand mining was the economic resources, and they were pretty much happy about selling their sands, and they put that as a top priority. They said securing aggregate as their first national goal, mechanization of the aggregate transport, rationalizing aggregate production. As you can see, they are driving this as a economic source. And they came up with the socialistic nature. And I was wondering whether the socialistic nature can be totally different from the viewpoint of capitalism. And North Korea has the concept of 주체. Of course, there are still many things that have not been controlled and remodeled by the humans, such as earthquakes, tsunami, and typhoons. However, history flows and the people develop, more areas and objects of the world will inevitably be dominated by people. So they were depending on the dialectical materialism. And as you can see here, there are many things that can be controlled by the humans. That's the core message, what they are developing. So they have human-centric worldview within the concept of 주체. They are human-centric. So, but it's not about the humanism. So it's more like a human modernity, and they want to alter the nature. Their viewpoint is the nature will be developed as the human serves. When you are reading the North Korean document and archive, you can see how they represent about their national resources. This is a national magazine, the Foreign Trade. This is the catalog that they are sending to international resources. They say they have high quality resources, they have a good infrastructure, it is cheap, and they are proud of that. They are trying to get more investment from outside. They are introducing some of the regions that they are specialized in with rare resources. They are promoting that very actively. North Korea is also working on urbanization. North Korea is talking about acceleration of the construction. They want to build massive buildings rapidly with a huge volume. Let me conclude. Korea had two fixes. The first one is to get the sand, and the risk was transferred to North Korea. Actually, North Korea welcomed that risk transfer. The cheap nature has been kept within the process of the development. And there were some political processes within Korea. Within the EEZ, they banned the sand extraction, and a few years later, they deregulated the ban. And in the third phase of the urban development, we are wondering where we can get the cheap natural resources. And I was trying to track the flow of the materials that have been used for urbanization. We can read out the history of the Korean urban development. This is not just a strategy or the political process, but I added another lens, the inter-Korean relations. With the discourse about the Anthropocene, many people talk about only broad stuff. What I'm bringing here is a certain material can be localized and how it can have some impact in our society. And the interscalar vehicle can be something very interesting. And when we are tracking a certain material, we can have the interscalar approach. And we can read geopolitical relations and the developmentalism and the socialism regimes in Korea.
그리고 희망들, 그리고 한국이 발전주의가 겪어왔던
And we can see how the human development
교차했었는지,
and urban development have been put in place,
어떻게 이것이 교차했었는지,
and how that have been taking place in the peacetime.
구체적인 맥락들이 드러날 것 같고,
And we can find out some geopolitical context within the Anthropocene.
Anthropocene의 종류가 굉장히 여러 가지가
And
있어요.
there are various types of the Anthropocene, especially in Northeast Asia,
전체적인 맥락들,
considering the political context.
Anthropocene이 될 수 있지 않을까.
And Korea's local case can be one of a Anthropocene. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
lignite 이어서
That's continuing with the lignite, and now Professor Kim, the researcher Kim, mentioned about sand.
국가에 대해서 고정관념을 가진 사람에게
I have some fixed idea about the country. However, that these two professors and the researchers have given me new senses in terms of new knowledge. So Professor Dalby has waiting for a long time. I'm sorry for changing the order. Professor Dalby will talk about the climate and security. You might think that these two concepts are not that, the two concepts are contracting. However, he is extending the security and to the realm of climate. So his presentation will be followed by mine later. So when Professor Dalby is ready, I'd like to welcome Professor.
달비 교수님, 예, 반갑습니다.
Nice to meet you, Professor Dalby. Please start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to make this presentation. And greetings from just south of Vancouver, in case you're wondering where I am, in land that is once upon a time the living space for the peoples of the Salish Sea, as we now call this region. And the history of how we have changed this part of the world dramatically is at least part of the larger history of what we now talk about in terms of the Anthropocene. Security is a word that means an awful lot of things to numerous different people. It is used in different contexts. Most of us seem to think we know what it means most of the time, but frequently it turns out to be a very troublesome term indeed. Obviously, it's a matter of national security, protecting borders, protecting states from subversion, from terrorism, sometimes from crime. Obviously, it's a matter of global security insofar as we try to protect the global order of politics around the world. It's obviously tied into geopolitics, the kind of things that the previous presentation was talking about. It seems to be a good thing for most people. It refers to safety. Above all else, it refers to ensuring things will remain stable or safe into the future. After the Cold War, 30 years ago or so, there was attempts made by social scientists in various parts of the world, notably in Europe, as well as in the United States, to extend the things that security was referring to. We had economic security, obviously. We had security of money, security of how the economy worked, very obviously. We extended it to environmental security too, although it was far from clear 30 years ago what environmental security actually meant. It quickly became reduced in many cases to security of supply of resources, only most obviously in terms of the security of energy supplies from different parts of the world to where they were needed in cities, whether it's Seoul or Leipzig. The point is that it was about resources, and the environment was a supplier of resources, and ensuring that they could continue to arrive where needed, whether it was for making energy in Germany or building apartment blocks in Korea, The whole idea is that the resources will continue to arrive when they're needed. More interestingly, the whole discussion was also extended to human security, the idea that people should be safe in all sorts of circumstances. Life would be maintained, they could be healthy, they could have jobs and support themselves. And in that discussion, particularly in 1994 in the United Nations Development Report, it seemed that security seemed to relate to practically everything. Indeed, the critics would argue that that was precisely the problem. It was so widely interpreted that it didn't mean much of anything anymore, because if everything was about security, well, then security didn't mean much. The link with environment, of course, obviously was about forms of protection, which is also what traditionally national security has been about: protecting borders, protecting people, protecting environments. This seemed to be all a logical extension. And yet there seemed to be just that problem with the lack of clarity about exactly what security might mean. Clearly, it requires force sometimes to protect borders, to ensure that things aren't disrupted, may require force. It may require the use of violence to ensure particular social orders are maintained. And indeed, underlying much of the discussion about security is the threat of force. And of course, the classic modern definition of states is institutions that have a monopoly of legitimate force over a particular territory. I started thinking about this a long time ago, engaged in those debates before, to our introducer's comment, before climate was really connected up with this. Although, of course, recently climate has been connected up with it in all sorts of different ways. But I began thinking about force and violence and the physics involved in security. And of course, in American thinking, at least, this links directly to questions of nuclear bombs. It relates to questions of what we now simply usually call firepower, the use of weapons to dominate and control spaces, and how that works out, we're all being reminded of repeatedly these days in the Ukraine. I began to think about this a little differently. Next slide, please. Because when I started thinking seriously about the Anthropocene and started thinking seriously about how sciences were beginning to understand just how dynamic a world we live in, rather than a fairly stable one that we argue about and we try to secure our borders and we try to secure our resource supplies. But I began to realize, reading the science, the Earth system science, that we really were going to have to think about security in a much more complicated way. And I began to think about it in terms of how firepower isn't just about weapons, explosions, projectiles, guns, and so on. Because much of what our modern world is about involves large amounts of energy. The lignite problem in Germany we've heard about already. But more specifically, it involves burning stuff. Fire and combustion are the crucial physical processes that power about 80% of the energy use in modern societies, approximately. It varies from state to state, but that's a reasonable generalization. And of course, it is a matter of fire that is producing huge quantities of carbon dioxide. Because when you start to think about climate, of course, it isn't just a matter of protecting things. It's a matter of thinking very hard about what we are making, what we are producing. And in that sense, it links directly back to Neil Smith's argument about the production of nature. Because one of the things that modern societies are producing in huge volumes is carbon dioxide. We are making gases in the atmosphere in ways that require us to stop and think very much more carefully about climate. Next slide, please. It used to be for hundreds of thousands of years through most of human history, that the climate of our planet was determined roughly by the so-called Milankovitch cycles. Milankovitch was an astronomer who figured out very cleverly how it is that the Earth's orbit is modified over long periods, and how the Earth both tilts and wobbles in ways that mean that sunlight falls on the surface of the Earth slightly differently over long periods of time. And this is indeed one of the key mechanisms that has driven the climate of the planet for many hundreds of thousands of years. It's a matter of physics. Ice comes and goes depending in part on how these things work out, accelerated by the rise and fall of naturally occurring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But we no longer live in that world. Next slide, please. We live in one that now has a climate that is dominated by carbon dioxide, not by celestial mechanics. It's not Milankovitch cycles that change how the world's climate works now. It's the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is much more important in terms of thinking about the climate. So we have a world which is no longer the world of our ancestors, one where the climate was beyond our control. We are now having to think much, much more carefully, quite literally, about what we make, and thinking about the atmosphere as something that is increasingly artificial, in the crucial sense that the most important gas which determines the climate of our planet is now being produced by us, and how much more of it will be produced in coming decades is now the crucial question for global politics, because how it is that we may respond to this is now a matter of whether some societies can survive, or whether we will end up with major conflicts over the remaining agriculturally fertile lands, and over how it is that we will attempt to deal with these new circumstances that we have made. I like to show this graph because it is the story of all our lives, or at least of everybody on this in this conference that is younger than I am, because that literally is the graph of my life. When I was born, the Earth had less than 320 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now it's close to 420, and that's all in my lifetime, a dramatic change, which is illustrated by this graph. You've all seen it, but have you stopped and thought about it in terms of what the carbon dioxide number was when you were born? It links across the scales from the individual to the global, to go back to the earlier presentation. And I think it's a crucially important way to understand how we are involved in the global scale of how things are now being changed. Next slide, please. All of which suggests that we are living in an increasingly artificial world. And if that is the case, then there are increasing calls to artificially manage the climate crisis by intervening in that atmosphere much more directly. Putting large amounts of aerosols into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, is one of the suggestions for geoengineering, which will, so the advocates say, lead us to cool the planet a bit, while hopefully we sort out how to reduce the carbon dioxide levels. The volcano on the left of my illustration here, of course, is usually talked about in terms of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991. It exploded, or it had an eruption and put a lot of sulfur dioxide into the high atmosphere, which did have a cooling effect on the planet. So are we heading into a world where not only do we produce carbon dioxide, but we produce artificial high altitude clouds effectively to monitor, modify the global climate? Is that a form of security to keep the planet in more or less the conditions we have known through history? Clearly, this is all about security as production. It is about thinking about making worlds not protecting what we have, but actually thinking about the increasingly artificial world we live in the future. And this, of course, is how the whole idea of moving from protection to production and thinking about the kind of worlds that are being made has to be a crucial part of any serious attempt to think about security at the global scale. But it isn't enough just to think about climate. Next slide, please. There have been numerous warnings over the last few decades from scientists about just how fast this increasingly artificial world, what we now call the world of the Anthropocene, is killing off large numbers of species, wrecking ecosystems, stressing them by climate change too, but also changing landscapes dramatically and adding, yes, carbon dioxide, of course, into the oceans to make them more acidic as well. So we are dealing with a world which not only is climate changing, but we're also rapidly losing numerous species. And of course, changing what gets produced in terms of the species, in terms of which animals get produced in huge numbers, is all of what the discussion of agriculture, eating meat, and all of that is all about. Because we have changed, not only are we killing off large numbers of species by wrecking their habitat, sometimes completely removing them as we turn forests into fields, but we are also dramatically changing the mixture of species in the planetary system. Next slide, please. We have changed wild spaces into agricultural spaces. We have changed dramatically the number of wild animals relative to humans and, crucially, to the livestock that we use as food and as pets. Goats and pigs and sheep, horses and cows are on this diagram. And I think we need to understand that we are literally making huge populations, not only of people these days, but how we do agriculture. We are factory farming. We are changing the animal mix on the planet dramatically. And we need to understand that this too is a form of production. We are producing food, we are producing pets, and in the process, we are dramatically changing landscapes and squeezing the territory that wild animals have dramatically into small reserves, into small areas where they are struggling to survive in many cases. And this too is something we need to stop and think about, because what species are we securing for the future? How can we remake our planet in a way that allows us to thrive, but also allows the other species that the long-term future of life needs to be secured? That is a crucial question that we also need to address when we link our traditional notions of security with the new context of the Anthropocene. Next, please. John Head has written this book a couple of years ago, suggesting that we need a new agriculture in all sorts of ways that emphasizes the importance of ecology, keeping ecosystems going and harvesting food in ways that doesn't wreck soils and doesn't reduce the biodiversity in the ways that modern agriculture has frequently done. We need new forms of agriculture, but we also need to stop and think very carefully about how we govern these, because of course the states that we have, the bizarre sometimes borders that divide the political regions of our world don't line up well with the biomes, as they're called, the big, large biological regions, and those two are actually being shifted, changed, moved by climate change too. So we need to stop and think about all sorts of new institutions that can provide agriculture, but also monitor how it changes, how it moves, and think about how it is that we may want to govern agricultural production in numerous different parts of the world, using similar sets of guidelines, perhaps, for the different parts of the world that have similar kinds of ecological systems. This is a dramatically different kind of view of the world from the traditional one of national security, where we have clearly defined boundaries that are protected by firepower or the threat of the use of force. We need to stop and think about this. And he talks about corporate trusts and various legal ideas which look to the very long-term future, not to the short-term financial return on agricultural investments. And this suggests thinking about life in the long term, thinking about a bunch of arrangements for agriculture, but also for ecology, which are very different from the monocultures, the crops that we now cut and then clear the land and replant every year. This is the kind of rethinking that is now necessary in the Anthropocene as we understand just how ecologically dynamic the world actually is. Next, please. This is emerging as a discussion now. Matt McDonald's book last year explicitly says that what we need to focus on securing is ecological fecundity. The ecosystems have to now be what it is that we seek to secure if human life in the long term in the planet is going to be thought about intelligently. And how it is that we might do that, next slide please, is increasingly also a matter for speculation by novelists. The Ministry for the Future from Kim Stanley Robinson is a novel that actually asks the question about what would a ministry for the future, a department of government, in this case a department of the United Nations for the future, actually look like, and what would it do? Because the tremendously rapid changes that we're currently living through require us all to stop and think as scholars, as activists, as citizens, as researchers. We all need to stop and think about how we are shaping the future for the next generation and for many generations further into the future. Because of course, to go back to the point about production, the sheer scale of human activity, whether it's digging up lignite, whether it's importing sand from under the oceans or from other countries, the sheer amount of material that we are moving, the sheer amount of making dramatically, and the atmosphere and so on. In this efficient world, to be about reinvest in. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Because in at least the energy sector, which is the most obvious one for thinking about climate, over the last few years, more and more money is going into renewable solar years. The majority of building new facilities around the globe is increasingly moving in the right direction. Less and less money is going into making coal plants to generate electricity. That will probably change a little, at least in Europe, in the next year or two, as unfortunately Europeans respond to the war in Ukraine by importing more gas and trying to build new fossil fuel infrastructure. But the general trend around the world has been in the right direction, at least, as people begin to realize that we have got to produce energy that we all need for our cities and our lifestyles, doing it without relying on producing indirectly huge quantities of carbon dioxide. So in terms of what it is that we now need to understand security to mean, yes, it's about production. Yes, it's about what kind of world we are making, not just protecting stuff we used to have, but actually actively creating a more livable world, one where the climate is hopefully not too seriously disrupted later in this century. My final slide, please. If you can get that last slide. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. In this attempt to rethink environmental security, my most recent book, what I end up talking about is, yes, it's about investments. We need to invest in things other than oil wells. And we aren't just a matter now of protecting the military figure on the cover of my book. It isn't just a matter of protecting resources. It's a matter now of actively thinking about how we adapt to the new circumstances which the Anthropocene requires us to tackle. Yes, we need to adapt to the inevitable changes in the climate that are going to happen because of the carbon dioxide we've already made. We're also going to have to think about how we adapt to the necessity of changing that energy mix and all of the complicated consequences as we transition away from lignite to new energy sources as well, because inevitably there will be complicated geopolitical implications of moving from fossil fuels into a world where we rely on renewable sources to a much greater extent. We need to do this quickly. And security now, rather than being protecting what we used to have, protecting access to resources, has to be about protecting our ability to adapt to these new circumstances. We need to think about security in terms of removing the roadblocks to rapid change, which will allow us to cope much better with climate, but also allow us to adapt and adopt the new energy systems that we need if we are going to produce a much less climate disrupted future in the next stage of the Anthropocene. So this is a requirement to rethink security quite fundamentally, but the Anthropocene, the recognition of the new circumstances in which we now live, requires nothing else from scholars, activists, policymakers, and citizens. And I hope that we can all work to move that thinking ahead quickly in coming years, because we really do need to rethink environmental security quite fundamentally because of the recognition of our new circumstances in the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 달비 교수님.
Thank you, Professor Dalby.
네, 그 안보에 대해서
He
안보의 개념을 확장해서
asserted that we have to
보호라는 게 과연
extend the concept of security, and he shared interesting opinions about security. I wonder if Professor Everts and Mr. Kim and Mr. Dalby, if you have questions, would you like to exchange your opinions after 10 minutes? So, because I'd like to give you some time to think about the questions that you'd like to exchange. And while giving the time, about 10 minutes to three gentlemen, I'd like to share my opinion. I submit this in article. I don't want to upload it because it's in the PDF form. I'd like to explain my opinion here. Professor Dalby mentioned this just before, that we have to think about what world we'd like to shape in terms of security. So he just mentioned about the SF novel, Ministry for the Future. That's a very interesting book. Unfortunately, the big powers of the current world and the advanced worlds and advanced powers are rely on unstable concept in a way they'd like to make the future. For example, with the Biden administration, he is using the vision focusing on strategic competition and cooperation, and he is leading the world to become the renewable energy-based world. And in China, the Communist Party, and this Communist Party convention, the two ideas have emerged, and they are interesting because the first concept is about green energy, which is related to climate
군사력의
security
강화에
and
대한
also increasing defense security.
그런데 제가 제 페이퍼를 자세하게 소개하진 않겠습니다.
I'm not going to
우리가
go in
시간이 많지
detail
않아서요.
into my article since we
제
don't have
핵심
enough
아규먼트는
time.
이런 겁니다.
My main argument is that
전략적 경쟁과
the
협력이라는 비전에
strategic
대해서
competition and
인수위
cooperation,
단계 때
which is
제가
the vision
강연이나
by
페이퍼나
President
칼럼을
Biden and
통해서
his
그런 문제 제기를 한 적이
administration,
있습니다.
I raised this
전략적
question.
협력과 전략적 경쟁과 기후의 협력 이건 공존하기
Strategic
힘들 거다.
competition and cooperation, and these concepts will not go with the climate change responding because the Biden is focusing on the competition against China. This is about the conflict about hegemony.
그래서 저는 당시 바이든 대통령을 저희 냉전의 역사에
That's why
활용해서 신냉전 리버럴이라고 이름을 붙인 바
I
있습니다.
referred his vision
바이든
as
대통령은
new
중국과의 21세기적
neoliberal
냉전을
conflict.
통해서
So President
중국으로
Biden
헤게모니에 이행되는 것을 모든 수단과 방법을
is
통해서
doing all
막겠다라는
his
생각을
means to
했고요.
make sure that the hegemony, the power is not transmitted to China. And John Kerry,
미국에선 이거를 짜르라고 표현합니다. 총체적인 지휘자인 존 케리 전
John
국무장관을
Kerry, the
통해서
former
중국과
defense
함께
minister,
기후 레짐을 만들어가겠다라는
is
게
working with with
그
Biden
구상이었는데요.
because he wanted to
하지만
build
이 신냉전 리버럴이란 측면이
climate,
지배적일 수밖에
the power
없습니다.
that he led to respond to the climate
영국에서
change.
미국으로 헤게모니가 넘어갔을 때와
The hegemony
달리
was transmitted
미국에서
from
중국으로
the
헤게모니가
UK to
넘어간다면
US.
이것은 끔찍한
But
디스토피아적
he
상황이라는
thinks that
그
the
생각이
hegemony should
미국의
not be transcended to China
지배적입니다.
because it's
그에 대한 규범적인
very
판단을
horrific,
떠나서 그것이
will
맞고
end
그름을
up
떠나서
will be horrific
이
ending.
문제의식과
Whether
기후라는
it's
건
right or
기후
not,
협력이 함께하기가 어렵습니다.
I'd like to point out that
여기에는
this kind of
상대편인
hegemony and the
중국
conflicts
문제의식이
and
결합되어
the
있기도
climate
합니다.
change
중국 공산당은
rectification cannot go
미국이
in line.
중국을 수단과 방법을 가리지 않고
Without
팔을
with
비틀려고
using
한다라고
all
하는
means,
강력한
U.S. is trying to refrain from China from emerging as new power,
그 문제의식을 갖고 있습니다.
and also the U.S. is very careful about China suppressing Taiwan. So in China, in the party convention, that they are also raising voice about suppressing Taiwan. So against this backdrop, I think the future world is being shaped into a new order. I don't know if I can call this situation an order because there is no order.
이번 중국 공산당 당대회가 끝나고 나면
After the Communist Party
대만을
convention,
둘러싼 27년까지의 무력 경쟁
the arms conflicts will be accelerated by 2027.
한 가지 워딩을 빠뜨렸는데요.
I forgot to mention one, and land-steel war arms conflict will emerge again between U.S. and China, and also the countries surrounding China and the U.S. are likely to be involved in the conflicts,
그래서
including
지금
Korea.
새로운 신국제 질서가 개막하고 있는데요.
So
혹은
the new
새로운 신국제
era
무질서가 개막하고 있기
of
때문에
order or disorder
원래
is
백악관의 의도,
emerging.
그리고 중국이 생태
So we
문명을
need to
헌법에
learn
집어넣었던
and that
의도가
what is the intention of the U.S.
누가
intention
규범적으로
and also
옳은지를 떠나서
Chinese intention
그것이 현재
of pursuing
서해 있는
ecological
냉정한
path,
현실
especially in the China. I don't
그래서
think these two
현재 전
visions will be
지구적인,
successful.
기후 레짐을
Biden
열망하는
and also
사람들은
the China,
이러한
the
냉엄한
Communist
현실
Party
인식
are
속에서
pursuing
전략적
ways that they can
경쟁과
rectify climate
기후의
issues, but
협력이라고
since
하는
they are
애매한
pursuing
상황을
hegemonial power
기후 레짐으로
conflicts,
이행하기 위해서 어떤
I don't think
고민과
their
실천적 행동을 할
pursuit for
것인가에
climate
대한
change
전
rectification
지구적
would be
중지를 모아야
successful.
될 때라고
Therefore, I
생각합니다.
think this is the time that the globe
그
has to
점에서
put our heads together
사실은
to
많은 학계의 연구
make
결과가 증명하듯이 너무나
agreement
규범적이고 공허한
about the
이야기처럼
issues.
들리긴 합니다. 하지만 학계의 솔리드한
It
연구
sounds
결과인데요.
too empty. However, scholars mention that
어떤
this kind
워싱턴
of
정가나 중국
transition
공산당 지도부의
that
생각을
we'd
바꾸는
like to
것에서 변화가 출발하기는 어렵습니다.
cannot find the
결국
change of
변화는
thinking in the US or China.
시민들의 마음속
Because
깊숙이에 있는
change
사유의 방식,
should be
가치관,
reflecting the
태도,
agenda,
감각,
idea,
이런 것들을
thoughts,
바꾸는
and
데서 출발할
senses
수
in
밖에
the
없습니다.
citizens.
저만 하더라도 신도시, 아까 김준수 연구원님이 말한 신도시에서 살고
Mr.
있지만
Kim
제가 살고 있는
introduced the
아파트의
examples
모래라고
of
하는 데 대한
urban
이
construction
감각을 가지고
project.
수십 년간 살아오지는 않았습니다. 그런 감각을 바꾸는 것.
So citizens, each citizens should change the frame of thoughts, and regardless of your political pursuit, we need to go for the same purpose. Although it sounds too empty, that we have to make an agreement. That is why to rectify such issue, that People for Earth is pursuing biocracy. Professor Dalby mentioned that we have to shape the concept for security. And recently, I made a presentation about biocracy. I emphasized biocracy as the fourth suggestion. I don't want to go into detail about it. According to Professor Dalby and also Professor Everts, new skill politics are required, and we need a new imagination in shaping our world. And if citizens are invited in the thinking process, although things looks too gloomy, we can achieve a transition toward ecological world. Since the time is limited, I now like to ask three gentlemen if there are questions or comments that you would like to add to other professors or other opinions in the audience are welcomed. Your opinions and questions are all welcomed.
And amongst the panels and from the panel, is there any question? I'm asking you. Professor Dalby, Professor Everts, and Mr. Kim, whoever, if you have a comment or a question.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity for asking questions as well. And thank you, Professor Ahn, for your kind words. I was wondering, and this goes to Simon Dalby as well as Junsoo Kim, if I see this from our European perspective today, the geopolitical firepower security question and the environmental security transition to renewables now question, they seem to align in an interesting, but maybe also in an uncanny way, kind of. So we have a green extractivism that's very important at the moment. So it's not just about gas and electricity and warmth produced through gas, for example. It's also about raw materials like lithium, which we do not have in large quantities, but German country, for example, has decided that lithium-based batteries will be the future for mobility. So there's a new search for that. And somehow this all aligns up with the war in Ukraine. And I was wondering how you would make sense of this in a general sense, but also in your perspective, from a Canadian, American perspective, from a South Korean, East Asian perspective, and in relation to your own work. Thank you.
질문 감사합니다.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Kim.
말씀에 대해서 코멘트 해주시면.
Do you have any comment on this one?
지금 현재 어떤 지정학적인 상황에 대해서
So considering the geopolitical one and usage and the mobilization of the natural resources, yes, we are facing many issues right now. And regarding that,
안보에 대한 문제가 굉장히 많이
and actually security was the main issue that we talked about, and I am specifically focusing on sand in my research.
계속해서 이제 새로운
And sand is like an example of the strategy goal for the cheap resources. That is an ongoing in the process. And according to the Korean framework for aggregate development, the Korean government is trying to find out the new port and try to extend the new sources of the import. Considering all this from the context of the planetary urbanization, there can be bigger supply chain and there can be bigger economic, security, and environmental issues. There can be competition among the agenda within the Korean politics and those kind of other issues. There can be new conflict or new competition. Considering the geopolitical, geoeconomic factors, yes, they are dynamic and they are changing, at least in my research. So my future goal is to find out what is going to take place in the future.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
김준수 연구원님도 혹시 에버트 교수님의
Mr.
향후
Kim,
연구와
do you have any
그리고
questions
달비
to
교수님의 향후
Professor Dalby
연구에서
or Professor
혹시
Everts?
뭐, 도움을 주실 코멘트라든지
Do you have
혹은
any
궁금하신
comment
포인트
or any
짧게
questions?
얘기해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
우선 그 조나단 교수님의
And to Jonathan Everts, one thing interesting is how the speech action can make the politics of scale and how the statement can make the new scale. That was really interesting.
우리 경험했던 어떤 지정학적인
And considering the geopolitical situation of the Germany can be similar to that of South Korea, especially you talked about the powerful narrative.
통일 이후에 90년대
And after the national unification, even though the unification was made, however, there are some remaining tasks, for example, building the new infrastructure, new road, and there can be some kind of a strategy to attract more people from the big cities to the small town.
자본의 축적
That can be related to the crisis of the accumulation of the capital, and that can be closely related to construction and engineering. That was a strong message, and probably that can be directly related to South Korea, possibly after the national reunification in South Korea.
독일 통일의 경험
In the local scale, can you share a little bit more about your reunification experiences, how the population changing, how the regional environment are changing? Is there any way that we can take a look at it? And do you have any comments on that? That is the
일단
first question
그러면
that goes to you.
그 에버트 교수님 리플라이를 약간 듣고
And Professor
짧게
Everts,
듣고
please
또 아까 달비
reply to this
교수님이
one.
또
And
하실 말씀이
probably
있으셔서
Professor
또
Dalby
달비
has some
교수님으로
comments, and let me
이어지겠습니다.
move on to Professor Dalby a little bit later.
그럼
Jonathan,
혹시
first.
김준수 연구원님에 대해서
In response to Mr.
에버트
Kim.
교수님 짧게 리플라이 해주실 게 있으면 예.
Short reply from your side.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, Junsoo. I could obviously talk for a long time on that question, but very briefly, I mean, locally, there has been huge changes environmentally as well as economically after reunification. So this area here was badly polluted. So people actually had bad lung problems. They had black houses and everything. But nowadays they have like a nostalgic belonging for these things. So it's really interesting to see how they say, oh, well, actually we didn't mind the pollution so much, but we had jobs, we had economic security, and we had the security of a system where you would know what would happen. So a lot of people tend to forget all the bad things. And then, but on the other hand, there's a younger generation that has not experienced that grew up in a reunited Germany. And to them, it's just like, it's a nice area that has now a lot of nice attractions as well, but they move away because of loss of jobs and loss of future opportunities. And this is the main issue for the regions, how to juggle this, how to get this into one order. So you have not the worst pollution in whole of the country anymore. You have a nice landscape and everything. You have actually towns with affordable living spaces, something that gets rarer and rarer in Germany as a whole. But then you don't have a reason to stay because there is nothing to do. And that's one of the big issues they have to find out. But that was only a very brief answer, something that we could probably discuss at more length and even bring it in line with the experiences in Korea and what would happen if reunification ever materializes there. But I think we're going now over to Simon Dalby. Thank you.
네, 에버트 교수님 감사합니다.
Professor Everett, thank you.
에버트 교수님과는 이게 짧은 패널 토론이 아니라 같이 공동
I
워크숍
think
같은
we
거를
need to hold a
해야 되지 않을까
co-workshop with
생각이
Professor Everett
그리고 달비
because it's
교수님
too
기다리고
short.
계신데요.
So
달비
since
교수님
Professor
또,
Dalby is
질문이나
waiting,
코멘트를
I'd like to
할
ask you if
있으시다고
there
하네요.
is a comment or a
교수님
question that you'd
연결해
like to share with us.
예, 기다리셨습니다.
Professor
예,
Dalby, thank you for waiting.
I would like to respond to the question that Professor Everts has raised in terms of the green extractivism and related questions. The point about energy security in Ukraine and in Europe reminds us that fossil fuels are, yes, that fuels, and the supply has to continue to arrive. Both the Russian military discovered that in the early stages of the war when the Ukrainians very cleverly cut their supplies, and now much of Europe is discovering it, and when the Russians cut the supplies to Europe. The thing that is different about most renewables is that they do not use fuel. They do not involve combustion, therefore you don't have to have stuff to burn. And the physics of that are very different. Yes, you need zinc and various other substances for the renewable energy, and that's a problem in some places because those supplies are difficult to get hold of. But in terms of the total amount of environmental damage done by the extraction, what we tend to forget is that the fuels that are involved in fossil fuels involve huge amounts of materials. The steel for the pipelines, for the tankers, for the trucks, the depots, the highways that are involved, the railways that are involved for moving all this stuff are hugely environmentally disruptive. If the advantage of renewables is once they are built, they don't need to continue to have that huge amount of environmental disruption day after day to provide the stuff that gets burned. They are fundamentally different in that crucial dimension, and that's one of the things that we need to remember. We tend to forget that you don't need as many trucks and tankers and pipelines and ports and all the rest of it if you're not shipping huge quantities of fuel. And I think that that's one of the key things that we do tend to forget in this whole discussion. The really interesting question about hegemony also needs to be addressed. And it is worth remembering that hegemony is frequently based around certain economic assemblages. And in the case of Britain, its global hegemony was basically powered by coal. The American one has been basically powered by oil and to a substantial extent gas too. The real question for the long term then is, what's the next hegemony? Is it going to be one that is dominated by a particular state? Or is it going to be an economic system that is much less dependent on the power of particular states, whether it's China or the United States? And I think for the question of the future world order, I at least like to hope that politicians will begin to realize that their primary task now has to be to figure out how to share a crowded world rather than trying to dominate a divided one.
Thank you, Professor Dalby, for the comments. And that reminds me of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. John F. Kennedy realized, and he made a great speech, we are breathing the same air. That was the comment from the John F. Kennedy. As Professor Dalby mentioned, and I think that can be important message for the national policy makers, as time is almost due, and I would like to give 1 minute to Professor Everts. Professor Everts, Germany is going through this fundamental crisis. Everybody is suffering, and Germany is going through this painful winter. In this painful winter, is there a transition to renewable energy? Do you think there can be a positive future for the transition to the renewable? Just 1 minute.
Yeah, big question. Well, there is a transition towards new renewables for some time here now, and we're doing this for more than a decade now. But we are discovering now that we have been too slow, too little, too slow, in not enough places. But then on the other hand, and I mean, that's really important. I mean, we are a democratic country with a very huge tradition of doing things in a very local based, basic democratic way as well. So there is opposition to every large project you do, no matter if it's a fossil based one or a renewable based one. So you have to grant people the opportunity to say, no, I don't want this or that in my backyard, even if it's frowned upon in many other circles then. So we cannot be as fast as we need to be at the moment, and we will not solve this over the winter. We cannot build as many wind turbines or as many solar parks or whatever you would need to change the situation, even if we wanted to, and even if we'd use all the money available for it. I mean, there's limits to it. It's like just you need to have the material ready. You need to have the engineers ready. You need to have the technology ready and all these things. So we will have a cool winter, I dare to say. I'm not heating at the moment, and many people do not, because I'm paying actually 3 times the price of what I've paid a year ago for gas and electricity. And it's increasing more, and it's hard on my savings, but it's a lot harder for many other people on their savings. And we will see protests. We already see them, and they will get more. And of course, they're fired up by those countries who are hoping that countries like Germany will break apart over this, and we will see what happens. I have no idea. It's a completely unique situation. Most people here have never suffered this. I mean, it's like my parents' generation is the last generation that had energy shortcuts and shortages and things like that when they were younger. And I remember power cuts when I was a little child, so the light going off for a few minutes. But that was that. We never had energy security issues over the last 30, 40, 50 years, more or less. So this is a new situation, and we will see how we'll adapt to this. I don't know. I don't have an answer to this. Sorry.
So that was honest feedback, and that was inconvenient truth. We are living in the world of mixed order or disorder. Canada, Korea, Germany, many of them are living in the era of uncertainty. I sincerely hope that we can think about the new concept, new tool, and come up with a new creativity to overcome this crisis. Thank you very much, all the panelists and all the people who are with us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your solidarity. Thank you very much.